In Philippians 4, verse 4, we read, "Rejoice in the Lord always." And again I say, rejoice. Now to the child of God, it should be very natural to rejoice in the Lord. But when we read this passage very carefully, we see that it says to rejoice in the Lord always. Incidentally, let's talk a minute or two about that word, always. The Greek word that is translated here as always is also translated many times in the Bible as always, as a plural word. For example, in Luke 18, verse 1, we read, "Men ought always to pray." The same Greek word is translated as both always and always. So we know either word is acceptable and has the same meaning. Now, always means all the time. No matter how you feel or what circumstance you might be having, how can that be possible? This is a tremendous and difficult statement. You just got terrible news. One of your children has been killed. Do you rejoice? You're supposed to rejoice always. We do not rejoice in the bad news. We grieve for the loss of our child. How can we rejoice then? We rejoice because in spite of this terrible situation, God is in control, and we have His wonderful promises. Somehow, even this terrible event is under the plan of God, and therefore is going to somehow work out to the praise and glory of God. When a terrible calamity occurs in our life, we do not try to rejoice over that situation, but our great assurance is that God is in charge. Though it may be a horrible situation, ultimately it works into God's perfect plan, under His care and control. To rejoice in the Lord always in itself is a very big and tremendous admonition to the child of God. It enables us to look at a terrible event in an entirely different way than it appears to be. But if we find we cannot rejoice in the face of tragedy or hardship, what shall we do? God is the one who enables us and helps us. God tells us in Philippians 4, verse 13, "I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me." God doesn't promise the believers that we will not have suffering in this life, but He promises to give us His strength so we can be assured that no matter what happens in our lives, we are able to rejoice in the Lord always, because God is perfectly in control. In other words, the situation will never be where we simply can't stand the suffering and we begin to move in the direction of death because of the terrible suffering. We have our trust in God, and that is where we get our strength. If you are not a child of God, none of this will make sense. It seems ridiculous to talk about rejoicing always. A tragedy is a time for breakdown, for being overcome with unhappiness and despair. This is our natural reaction to tragedy. There is nothing sinful about grief. God has put love in our hearts, and it is natural to grieve in the face of tragedy. But if our trust is altogether in Christ, there is an enormous strengthening that helps us face the panic and the terrible unhappiness of the event. Without Christ, we cannot always get past our grief. It can overwhelm us. But with Christ, we can change the focus of our feelings of grief, of unhappiness, to the almighty comfort of knowing that God is in charge. Only in Christ do we have this comfort, and it is magnificent and wonderful. It is our trust in God that gets us through that difficult time. And furthermore, we can rejoice because of God's marvelous gift of salvation, that we are completely in His hand. We are told in Psalm 40, "Let all those that seek Thee rejoice and be glad in Thee. Let such as love Thy salvation say continually, The Lord be magnified." May many who are tuned to our broadcast be drawn to the joy of the gospel of Christ, that they too may eternally rejoice with us always.